The air inside the Long Beach Sports Hall was heavy with sweat and anticipation, the kind of smell that clung to rubber mats and cotton uniforms long after a day of training. It was late afternoon, the sun still pressing against the tall windows, painting streaks of orange across rows of wooden bleachers filled with young karate students. Some whispered to each other in bursts of nervous energy, others stretched idly, waiting for the next demonstration. It was the late 1960s, and California had become a strange crossroad. Martial arts, still exotic for most Americans, had begun to spread like wildfire. Tournaments, seminars, late-night dojo sessions, young men lined up to learn something that felt ancient, powerful, disciplined. And in that hall, on that day, two names carried more weight than all the others. Joe Louis and Chuck Norris. Louis had already been crowned champion, tall, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, with the confidence of someone who knew the crowd loved him. He was blunt, sharp-tongued, his presence impossible to ignore. Students looked at him as if he were proof that karate could be American, brash and unyielding. Norris, still carving his path, carried himself differently. Smaller, quieter, dark hair slicked with sweat from drills, eyes watchful but not boastful. He had already begun to build a reputation, reliable, disciplined, precise. But where Louis burned hot, Norris was cool, self-contained. The seminar had been routine, Louis demonstrating techniques, the crowd applauding. Then the question came, shouted from somewhere in the bleachers, what about Norris? For a moment, Louis smiled, wide and effortless, but there was something predatory in it. He turned so the entire hall could see his face. His voice carried over the restless shuffling of feet and the squeak of GI fabric. Norris, he said, letting the name hang a second too long. He's strong in the movies. But in a real fight? He paused, his grin sharpening. His technique's a joke. The word sliced through the room like a blade. For half a beat, silence reigned. Then laughter burst, jagged and contagious. Young karateka nudged each other, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads in disbelief but joining in anyway. The echo of it filled the rafters. Chuck didn't laugh. He didn't speak either. He simply stood at the edge of the mats, his body still, his jaw tight. His eyes fixed on Louis, unblinking. That stare was not angry, not yet, but steady, almost too steady. And in that silence, with fists curling lightly at his sides, he radiated something the crowd couldn't name. The noise of laughter faltered, softened, trailed off. A few students whispered, as though suddenly aware that they were part of something heavier than a joke. Louis thrived on the noise. He smirked, waved a hand to dismiss the tension, and launched into another demonstration, showing off combinations with exaggerated flair. But no one in the bleachers could erase the image of Norris, unmoving, absorbing the blow without speaking. That was the first cut, not a punch, not a kick, but words that landed where fists couldn't. By the time the seminar ended, the story had already spread through the hall. Students gathered in corners, whispering with a kind of greedy fascination. Did you hear what Louis said? He called Norris a joke. Some shook their heads, others repeated it with glee, enjoying the sting of scandal. Chuck walked past them all, sweat darkening the collar of his GI, his face unreadable. He didn't defend himself, didn't correct the record. But as he left the building, his silence felt heavier than denial. His fists, now relaxed at his sides, bore the faint marks of calluses split open again from the morning's drills. On the bleachers, two teenagers lingered long after the crowd left. One whispered, maybe Louis is right. Maybe Norris isn't as strong as everyone says. The other shrugged, unsure, but the seed was planted. The shadow of doubt spread, quiet but quick. By nightfall, the story was already bigger than the seminar. People carried it out into dojos, into coffee shops, into the small, growing network of karate magazines. It would be retold in bars and locker rooms, always with a laugh attached. But those who had seen Norris's face, those who had watched his fists clench and his stare refuse to break, felt something else. They sensed the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. And beneath the noise of rumor and laughter, a question lingered: what would Chuck do next? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The joke didn't stay in Long Beach. By the next morning it was already traveling, carried in locker rooms, whispered in dusty dojos, repeated in barbershops thick with the smell of shaving cream and cigarette smoke. The line hardened into a headline: Joe Louis says Norris is strong only in movies, his technique's a joke. Every retelling bent it slightly. Some swore Joe had roared it with a grin, others claimed he said it cold, like a judge delivering a verdict. However it was told, the sting stuck. Los Angeles absorbed the rumor quickly. At the JKA Club in Torrance, a group of brown belts traded smirks over it. In a Venice dojo, two young fighters debated until their voices carried into the street. A karate magazine editor, flipping through film negatives, scribbled in the margin, "Louis versus Norris? Rivalry coming." Crowds, always hungry for conflict, divided themselves neatly. Some leaned toward Joe. He was the first American champion, tall, loud, unashamed of it. Others leaned toward Chuck. He was quieter, steadier, the kind of man who didn't need applause. The split wasn't really about technique. It was about temperament. One side liked fireworks, the other liked fire that never went out. Chuck heard the whispers but didn't answer them. His response was the mat. He hit the heavy bag until the chain screamed at the ceiling beam. He repeated the same kick so many times the ball of his foot split and bled, a red crescent against the canvas. He wrapped his knuckles with cheap athletic tape, kept training until it frayed loose, then tied it again with his teeth. Nights, when the fog rolled in off the Pacific and muffled the city's neon, he stayed alone in the dojo, his shadow spilling across the mats under one flickering light. Each stance held longer than the last, his breath even, his body a metronome of discipline. Joe, meanwhile, lived in the daylight. He laughed, demonstrated flying kicks for exhibition crowds, winked at cameras, told stories with perfect timing. Photographers adored him, he always gave them something to shoot. Students clapped not only at his power but at his ease. He looked like strength was effortless. Promoters noticed the split. Two names pulling a crowd in opposite directions, it was too easy. They started whispering about a demonstration, careful not to call it a fight. Just a friendly spar after a seminar, one organizer said with a smile too sharp. The word friendly repeated until it lost its meaning. The pressure built slowly. At a Santa Monica tournament, Joe stepped onto the floor to roaring applause. Chuck followed to polite claps, thin and uncertain. He bowed anyway, eyes down, the noise burning against his skin. He fought clean, precise, won his matches without showmanship. As he left the floor, a boy held out a program. Chuck signed it, asked the boy's name, wrote it down carefully. The boy went home with it tucked in his pocket, heart pounding. Later in the corridor, two promoters cornered Chuck, voices casual, eyes hungry. "People want to see it," one said. "Just light sparring. Nothing serious." Chuck wiped sweat from his jaw and answered only, "If the drills help, I'll do them." He gave them nothing more. But the world wanted more. Small magazines printed gossip under anonymous bylines. Radio hosts hinted at tension. Flyers appeared with dates and names bold enough to bend the paper. Crowds began to form in advance. A machinist traded his Saturday shift to get a seat. A mother saved grocery money for a ticket, not for herself but for her son. Even those who claimed not to care found themselves repeating the story in break rooms, voices lowering with excitement. On the night before the bout, Chuck stayed late in the dojo. The air smelled of liniment and sweat soaked deep into the mats. He shadowboxed without a mirror, counting only breath, listening for flaws in the rhythm of his steps. He finished by kneeling, eyes closed, palms on his thighs. He didn't pray for victory. He prayed for control. Across town, Joe laughed with a group of students in the back of a gym. Someone asked if he was ready. For what? He grinned, and they laughed with him. The morning of the event dawned gray, fog still clinging to the freeways. The venue wasn't glamorous: bleachers, squeaky floorboards, windows streaked with dust. The mats were taped together, one seam already curling at the corner. But by noon the place was packed, 300 bodies, restless, buzzing. The air carried the tang of sweat and soda. Backstage, Chuck tied his belt with practiced care, his hands steady despite the noise filtering in from outside. He could hear Joe already, working the crowd without even trying, his laugh drawing them closer like moths to a flame. A runner ducked behind the curtain. 5 minutes, he said. They're calling for both of you. Chuck stood, brushed the dust off his GI. The hallway to the mat stretched ahead of him, long and narrow, the light at the end pulsing with sound. He walked it slowly, one hand grazing the wall. Contact. Proof. When he stepped into the gym, the noise bent toward Joe first, applause, whistles, a chant even. For Chuck, only scattered claps, hesitant, unsure. He bowed anyway. Then from the bleachers, a voice rang out, sharp as a whip, "Show him the real power, Joe." The crowd laughed, then hushed itself, guilty in the echo. Chuck didn't flinch. His eyes fixed on the mat. Joe rolled his shoulders, grinning. The announcer called it a light demonstration. No one believed it. The air was too tight, the stakes already set. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be light. The gym in Los Angeles didn't look like much from the outside, just another block of faded brick with peeling paint and a parking lot half filled with dusty Chevys. But inside, the air felt different. The bleachers groaned under the weight of hundreds of bodies, the buzz of voices rolling back and forth like waves against a pier. The mats, taped together in neat squares, smelled faintly of disinfectant, sweat, and rubber, the kind of scent that seeps into the skin. The announcer's voice was barely needed. Everyone already knew why they were here. Joe Louis was the first to step onto the mat. He moved with easy confidence, chin high, grin spread wide. He raised a hand to the crowd, and the applause hit like a slap of thunder. He basked in it, gesturing to someone in the front row, cracking a joke that made people laugh even though they couldn't quite hear it. His GI was crisp, belt tied with casual carelessness, as though even the uniform bent to him. He looked like he owned the space before the match had even begun. Then Chuck Norris entered. No raised hands. No jokes. He walked with a steady pace, eyes forward, posture tight. He bowed once to the judges, then again to the mat itself, his movements sharp and exact. The applause for him was scattered, polite, nothing close to the eruption that had greeted Joe. But the stillness of his entry shifted something in the room. He wasn't performing for them. He was there for the fight. The crowd felt the difference. They leaned forward, sensing the collision coming. The referee motioned them to the center. Both bowed. For a moment they stood eye to eye, the contrast stark. Joe, smiling, loose shoulders, the showman at home in the spotlight. Chuck, narrow-eyed, jaw set, his silence louder than words. The match began. Joe moved first, light on his feet, circling, flashing quick kicks that stopped just short of contact. The crowd roared at his speed. He danced around Chuck, darting in and out, his grin widening as he dodged the first sharp kick aimed at his ribs. He exaggerated his evasion, throwing his hands out as if to say, "Is that all?" Laughter spilled from the bleachers. Chuck didn't react. No smile, no frown. He reset his stance and pressed forward again. Joe threw a flurry, fast, sharp, designed to show control. He leaned back, slipped to the side, always half a step ahead. He looked like he was putting on a clinic, proving to the crowd what he'd already said out loud weeks before, that Norris wasn't at his level. The spectators clapped and shouted with every dodge, each cheer pressing heavier against Chuck's back. But then it happened. Chuck feinted high, then drove a simple straight kick to the body, not flashy, not theatrical. The sound of impact echoed off the walls, a flat, hollow thud against flesh and bone. Joe's grin faltered, just for a moment, his torso folding slightly as he absorbed the strike. The crowd's laughter choked off. The air in the gym changed in an instant. Chuck stepped back, calm, resetting his stance again as though nothing had happened. He didn't follow up, didn't gloat. But everyone in the room had heard it. The sound of contact was different from all the theatrics before. It was real. Joe straightened, grin snapping back onto his face like armor, but it was thinner now, strained at the edges. His eyes narrowed as he circled again, his movements sharper, faster. He was no longer performing just for the crowd, he was recalibrating, measuring, searching. The crowd grew quieter, leaning forward. The earlier cheers and laughter gave way to a tension that buzzed just beneath the surface. Whispers spread along the bleachers. "Did you see that? He caught him. That landed." Some clapped nervously, unsure whether to support Joe's resilience or Chuck's composure. Others simply stayed silent, sensing that something had shifted. On the edge of the mat, a boy clutched his program tighter, eyes wide. Even he understood, this wasn't just a demonstration anymore. The referee called for them to reset, but the atmosphere had already transformed. It was no longer entertainment. It was a test of pride. And as the two men circled each other again, sweat glistening on their brows, every person in that room realized the same thing: this was only the beginning. The storm had arrived. The tempo shifted until no one could pretend it was still an exhibition. What began as light sparring had turned into a duel for something larger than points. The air inside the gym grew thick with heat and noise, every creak of the bleachers underscored by the smell of sweat and rubber mats. People weren't clapping out of politeness anymore. They were watching the way you watch a storm gather on the horizon. Joe Louis tried to pull the storm back under his control. He widened his stance, circled with swagger, and snapped a high kick that skimmed close to Chuck's jaw. He reset and laughed, tossing a line to the crowd. "You see that? That's how it's done." The bleachers erupted, laughter and cheers spilling down toward the mat. For a moment it looked as if he'd reasserted his grip. Chuck didn't respond. He stepped in, absorbed a back fist on his guard, took a body shot that thudded against his ribs, and reset his stance without expression. The strikes landed clean but failed to move him. He breathed slow, shoulders square, eyes never leaving Joe's. The calmness unnerved the room, and it began to unnerve Joe most of all. He threw another combination, fast, sharp, meant to sting. Chuck absorbed 2 shots in silence, then advanced half a step, forcing Joe to backpedal. The crowd roared, divided now into 2 camps. One side shouted, "Let's go, Joe," with the confidence of loyal fans. The other began to answer with, "Come on, Chuck." The noise collided in the rafters, the hall itself becoming a third force pressing on both men. Joe tried to feed it. He danced, dodged a straight kick, and turned his head just enough to smirk at the audience. But when his eyes came back, Chuck was already there, planted, fists curled, expression unchanged. That steady presence stripped Joe's performance of its shine. Each sarcastic word sounded thinner against silence that refused to yield. Then came the mistake. Joe overextended, just slightly, when he threw a spinning strike meant to dazzle. His shoulder rolled too far, his guard opened. Chuck read it instantly. He pivoted tight and drove a compact punch straight into Joe's lead shoulder. Not a knockout blow, not a dramatic haymaker, just clean, precise contact. The sound of it was dull and heavy. Joe's face flickered, his teeth clenched as his arm dipped half an inch before he forced it back up. For the first time, the grin cracked. The gym inhaled as one. The laughter died. A hush spread, broken only by scattered gasps. People in Joe's corner froze mid-cheer, hands stalled halfway in the air. Across the bleachers, Chuck's supporters found their voice, clapping hard, shouting, "There it is." The balance had shifted. Joe rolled his shoulder twice, tried to mask the pain, and forced a smile. But it wasn't the same smile. The edges were strained, his voice gone. He had stopped talking. Chuck didn't celebrate. He stepped back into stance, breathing steady, his face unreadable. The refusal to gloat cut deeper than the punch itself. It said he expected to land again. The noise in the room thickened. No longer bright applause, no longer laughter, it was tension-given sound, a restless tide that kept rising. Students stood without realizing it, gripping the railings. A woman leaned forward, her hands clenched in prayer without words. Even the referees hung back, reluctant to interrupt something that had clearly outgrown them. Joe flicked a jab, testing, then another. His shoulder hissed warning pain with every movement. Chuck slipped both and closed the gap by inches. The silence between them became the loudest thing in the room. What had begun as a staged exhibition was now something raw, uncontained. It wasn't about scoring. It wasn't about showing off. It was about pride straining against the weight of the crowd, about two men realizing that only one could walk away with his image intact. And for the first time, Joe Louis looked across the mat and saw an opponent he could not joke away. The hit to Joe's shoulder drained the room of jokes. He rolled it once, twice, trying to disguise the stiffness, and when he looked back at Chuck there was no smirk left to wear. The air cooled around them despite the heat, a hush settling heavy enough that the squeak of bare feet sounded like chalk cutting slate. The bleachers stopped being an audience and became witness. Joe's stance changed. No more showman looseness. He pulled his guard tighter, weight set evenly, eyes narrowed to the small truths that live in timing. He feinted high with none of his earlier flourish, probed with a jab, then another, testing the joint and the man. The pain answered each punch with a private spark he refused to show. Chuck matched the honesty. He crept into range by inches, chin tucked, hands disciplined, no invitation to chaos. When Joe snapped a kick to the outside thigh, it landed with a slap that drew a wince from the upper rows. Chuck took the shock into his hips, exhaled through his nose, and gave the mat back the weight it had tried to steal. They circled once more, and it wasn't spectacle anymore. It was work. Silence deepened. Even the hecklers ran out of nerve. All that remained was breath, two metronomes beating inside different chests. The referee drifted on the edge, palms half raised, then decided he was not the center of this story and let it run. Joe stepped in behind a double jab, elbow discreetly guarding his sore shoulder, and found Chuck's forearms waiting like a door that won't budge. He pivoted offline and tried to cut an angle, but Norris mirrored the turn and shut it down with a shin block that sounded like a baseball bat kissed by rain. Joe's face didn't change. He wouldn't give the room that gift. The crowd split began to mend, but not in Joe's favor. The voices for Norris grew firm, clean, without bravado. Stay on him, Chuck. Breathe. The old chant for Joe flickered and dimmed, not out of betrayal but because admiration had changed addresses. People were not responding to power now, they were answering to control. Between exchanges, they stood close enough to feel the heat off each other's skin. Joe's lips parted, maybe to summon another line, maybe to bait. He met a gaze that wasn't playing that game. And then Chuck did the strangest thing you can do in a fight. He spoke, not to the bleachers, but to the man in front of him, voice low enough that only the nearest rows heard and the rest felt. "You taught me to be strong," he said. "But strength isn't knocking people down to prove it. No venom in it. No theater. Just a fact laid carefully on the mat between them." It landed harder than any kick. Joe blinked, a microbeat of recognition, the kind you deny even to yourself. His weight shifted a hair late as he resumed motion, and in that sliver Chuck threaded a straight counter to the body, tight, disciplined, nothing wasted. The thud folded Joe for a heartbeat before he caught himself and straightened. The gym erupted. Not the giddy roar of earlier, but a deep, rolling surge that felt like relief finally finding a voice. People stood without deciding to. A woman near the aisle clapped until her palms stung. The boy with the program shouted a single word, "Yes." Surprised at its size. Joe backed out a step, set his feet again, and met Chuck's eyes with something new, not hatred, not yet, but seriousness uncolored by charm. That look admitted equality. It also admitted danger. He put away everything that didn't serve him, no wink, no talk, and tried to rebuild with discipline alone. They went back to work. Short bursts. Close quarters. The rhythm grew spare and brutal, contact, recoil, reset. You could hear the mats complain, hear the wet pad of sweat shedding from a GI sleeve mid-swing. Joe's best weapons still flashed, but he spent them carefully now, buying time while his shoulder negotiated the rate. Chuck refused the sale, pricing every mistake with a touch that said "I saw that." Then came a passage that felt like truth written in movement. Joe tried to bully the pocket. Chuck wouldn't be bullied. Joe tried to dance the perimeter. Chuck cut the ring with patient steps, closing doors without slamming them. Joe's breath left him rough around the edges. Chuck stayed even, not because he wasn't hurting, but because he had decided what would be allowed to show. The crowd felt the shift and made it louder. "Respect," someone yelled, and the word stuck to the rafters. The earlier accusation, that Norris was only strong in stories, dissolved under the weight of what everyone could see, a man refusing to be moved by mockery or speed, building himself one measured exchange at a time. For Joe, the loss wasn't points. It was gravity. The room that used to tilt toward him had found level ground. He frowned, not at Chuck, exactly, but at the sensation of footing he'd never had to test. He cut left, right, changed levels, offered a feint so clean it fooled the first two rows and no one on the mat. Chuck's answer was a check and a small, cruelly precise kick to the calf that didn't look like much until Joe's balance hiccuped and he needed a half step to hide it. Groans swelled, sympathy mixed with awe. No one was laughing now. The gym had become a listening device for pain and pride. The promoters at the wall stopped smiling. The timekeeper missed his mark and swore under his breath. The photographers quit chasing faces and aimed at hands, at feet, at the tiny wars won in inches. Joe drew a breath and with it drew a line. He slid forward behind a jab that asked a question. Chuck answered with a parry and another body touch that didn't satisfy the crowd but did something more efficient, it subtracted. Joe felt the subtraction and knew what it meant. If he couldn't change the math would change him. He set his jaw, and for the first time looked older than he had at the opening bell. Chuck didn't press for spectacle. He stayed exact, tidy, impersonal. This wasn't vengeance, it was correction. And that, more than anything, began to peel the crowd away from Joe's legend and toward Chuck's character. Admiration is loud. Respect is heavier. The room had gone heavy. On the next clinch, forearms grinding, sweat slick between fabric, Chuck's mouth moved again, so small the cameras missed it. "We can both walk out with our heads up," he said. "Up to you." Joe didn't answer. He couldn't, not with words. He answered with a tight hook over the top that glanced off guard and cost him 3 degrees of shoulder pain. His face twitched and smoothed. He had chosen. The bell, imagined or real, seemed to hover. The exchanges shortened further, boiled down to nerve and code. Every time Joe reached for the old persona, the joint warned him back. Every time Chuck considered finishing hard, discipline pulled him to center. The third force, the crowd, settled its verdict for the night. The chant for Norris came full, unforced, a low thunder that rapped the mat and pressed in. Joe heard it. You could see the sound land on his back. He wasn't done. But he was no longer carrying the room. And as they squared for the next series, both men bleeding from the mouth in thin, bright lines, the gym held a single breath. What came next would decide not just about, but ownership of the story that would leave the building with them. The final minutes pressed the gym into silence. Heat clung to the walls, the mats darkened with sweat, and every breath seemed to echo. Both men carried the marks of the fight, thin lines of blood at the mouth, bruises where cloth couldn't hide them. The word demonstration had no meaning anymore. This was something closer to survival of pride. Joe moved first, shoulders squared, the grin long gone. His punches came short, precise, without the flair that had once drawn applause. Each jab cost him a wince he refused to show. His footwork was still sharp, but it no longer danced, it trudged, efficient and stripped of spectacle. Chuck stood firm. His guard never dropped, his breathing stayed measured. He absorbed a low kick, exhaled, then stepped forward as if walking through a door no one else could see. He gave the crowd no show, no flourish, only control. The room leaned into that silence, waiting. The crowd was no longer split. Some still called Joe's name out of loyalty, but the chant for Chuck grew heavier, steadier, carrying weight the other side couldn't match. Phones snapped photos, reporters scribbled furiously. The gym had become a courtroom, and every exchange on the mat was testimony. Joe tried to seize momentum with a sudden rush. He threw a jab cross and angled for a high kick, his old rhythm flashing for a heartbeat. But when his shoulder over-rotated, the pain betrayed him. Chuck read it instantly. First came the straight kick to the body, clean, brutal, subtracting air from Joe's lungs with a thud that echoed off the rafters. The crowd gasped in unison. Joe bent around the strike before he forced himself upright. Then, before he could fully reset, Chuck whipped a low kick into his lead leg. It wasn't spectacular. It didn't need to be. Joe's balance faltered, his stance dropping half an inch. Pain flickered across his face before he smoothed it away. The room froze. For a second there was no sound but the throb of sneakers on wood and heavy breathing. Then applause burst, raw, rolling, unstoppable. People leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices breaking with the release of tension. And Chuck stopped. He didn't press forward, didn't try to finish. He stepped back, lowered his guard just enough to show he had chosen restraint. His chest rose and fell, sweat dripping down his jaw, but his eyes stayed calm. He had made his point. The ovation grew louder. Not the wild cheers of spectacle, but the deep, rhythmic clapping of respect. A boy in the front row shouted, "Yes!" and clapped until his palms reddened. Even those who had come for Joe found themselves standing. Joe remained upright, one hand pressed against his ribs, the other dangling heavy. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on Chuck. He didn't step forward, didn't offer his hand. He just stared, pride and pain tangled in his expression. It wasn't defeat, but it wasn't victory either. It was something harder, a recognition he didn't want to voice. Chuck bowed once, sharp and respectful. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't force the ending. He gave Joe the space to choose, and Joe chose silence. The referee stepped between them, mumbling something about demonstrations, safety, control. His words drifted away, swallowed by the sound of the crowd still clapping. Everyone knew what they had just seen wasn't rehearsal, wasn't exhibition. It was a battle for dignity. Reporters scribbled furiously, promoters whispered to each other about rematches, but the audience was caught on one image, Norris walking away without claiming triumph, leaving his opponent standing alone. He hadn't needed to prove strength with noise. He'd proven it with refusal, refusal to be baited, refusal to destroy when he already held the advantage. Joe's stare followed him to the edge of the mat, eyes dark with a mix of resentment and reluctant respect. He gave a single nod, not surrender, not friendship, but an acknowledgement that couldn't be denied. Chuck returned the nod, nothing more, and left the center without turning his back. His pace was steady, his posture unbroken. The gym exhaled all at once. People spilled into aisles, buzzing with what they had witnessed. Some claimed they'd seen Joe lose, others insisted no one had won. But the truth lay heavy in the air. Chuck had answered words not with rage, not with spectacle, but with character. And as the crowd filed out, still arguing, still replaying each strike in their heads, one question lingered like smoke: had this fight ended a rivalry, or had it just begun?